When performing a streak plate, the idea here is that you want to take your bacterial sample, whether it's a mixture or just a tons of bacteria, and spread it out over the whole course of the Petri dish. And in doing so, separate them such that you're depositing single cells all over the plate. We use what's called the Quadrant Method for sections, right? But what I like to do is understand what each quadrant does, and then allows you then to use each quadrant for its proper purpose, right? So quadrant one, whole purpose, is to inoculate. So I don't really waste a lot of space for my quadrant one because I'm not doing any separating, right? So I'm gonna grab here's my loop. I'm gonna grab my sample and then simply draw my quadrant one. Now it's important, go all the way to the edges, right? Make sure that you are using the space. You don't want to just, sometimes I'll see people go in the middle. You don't want to just go in the middle. Use that space, right? But go all the way to the edges, right? Now the general rule is always no overlapping. Don't go back on your own lines, right? However, because in quadrant one, we're not doing any separating, we are only inoculating, I actually go back and forth many, many times. Now, sorry, I'm obviously going outside of my circle, which you cannot, right? But you get the point. And so I go back and forth many, many, many times because it seems counterintuitive, but the more bacteria placed down in my first quadrant, the easier it becomes to separate them, right? Notice, by the way, I left a little spot right there. I'll explain what that spot does. Okay, so I streak quadrant one. I inoculated the plate with my bacteria. Now I'm going to sterilize. So I'm going to hold it in here. So I always do this, but actually I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to hold it, right? Let it get nice and hot, kill everything on my loop because I do not want to add more bacteria to this plate. In fact, all I want to do is take some of these bacteria here and spread it to our next quadrant. So in quadrant two, we're beginning the separating process, okay? So I'm gonna hold it in here, get it nice and sterile. And you remember this little spot here? What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna touch my loop to it. Just kind of like that. So usually I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I hold it, let the loop cool. So this way I don't have to wait the 15 seconds it takes to cool the loop, right? And then I'm gonna start quadrant two. So in my hand, I'm gonna turn my plate, and then take some of quadrant one and move it to quadrant two. Now, once again, we always say, don't streak between quadrants, right? However, you always have to streak between quadrants when moving from one quadrant to the next. So this is how I like to do it. In my mind, I draw this imaginary line kind of at the center of that first quadrant. And then I'm going to place a dot at the back of that line of the quadrant, okay? So this is in my mind. I don't actually draw it on the plate. Then I have a dot just outside of the first quadrant, right against the wall. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make I always say a Z, but actually it's an S, a zigzag line using these dots. So it's gonna look like this. Zip, 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 just like that, okay? So in doing so, I've taken some of the bacteria that I placed into quadrant one, and I'm beginning to move it to quadrant two. And then I'm going to continue my zigzag motion, just like that, trying to, as best I can, go to the edges here, trying as best I can not to cross into that first quadrant, okay? So even though I did that zigzag line first, and then making my zigzag lines, why aren't you doing it? The actual motion I do is one single motion. So it's look like this. Bang, that's quadrant two. Now, once again, sterilize, nice and hot, and then, right? And then we're gonna move to quadrant three. You can't see I'm doing this, but I'm turning the plate in my hand, and I'm gonna do the exact same thing. Imaginary line, dot, and dot. And then the motion I make with my hand is exactly what I did for quadrant two. Make my Z, and then try not to go back on my own lines. And then notice now my lines are much longer. I have a lot of space here and really start to spread the bacteria that I moved into Quadrant 2 over to Quadrant 3, right? And then for my fourth, I start to repeat. Once again, sterilize and turn the plate in my hand. Let's change colors so we can see the lines. And this time I'm not going to draw my lines and finish the plate out just like that, right? And so this now allows us to have a nice streak plate. This should give you the maximal amount of colonies. Now, where the colonies appear really depend on how much bacteria you place down. It depends on the nature of the bacterium that you're trying to separate. So you can have it sometimes in Quadrant 2, but usually in Quadrants 3 or 4, where you're going to get your isolated colonies, right? And so that's what we want to do, get nice and isolated colonies, so we can take our complex mixture of bacteria and separate them out into single cells.